Okay, so I'm going to discuss a statement. Everybody knows the media is bad for society, and particularly focus on video game violence as a possible protagonist for the doomed direction society is currently running towards. There's people out there such as Barbara Biggins, the CEO of the Australian Council on Children and Media, who stated in the Biggins reading that exposure to video game violence can cause oneself to become desensitized, to suffer a loss of empathy towards others, gain a lack of appreciation of the real life consequences of violence, and increases in risk taking activities, surely such as armed robberies, knife fights, and prostitute bashings, all because that's what you got a high score for the night before in GTA San Andreas. Now, this was surely the cause of the tragic Columbine High School massacre in 2001, where two fans of the popular first-person shooter game Counter-Strike went and shot and murdered a load of their classmates at school. This led to the families of the victims later attempting to sue the video game makers for billions of dollars. The lawsuit that they put forth literally stated that a combination of the use of and addiction to violent video games added to the boys' basic personalities and sort of fragile minds was to blame in this case. Uh, Without this, they said, and I'm quoting, these murders and this massacre simply would not have occurred. There was a similar case in 2007 after the Virginia Tech massacre where outspoken anti-video game activist Jack Thompson tried to blame video games by saying these are real lives, these are real people that are in the ground now because of this game, and he said, I have no doubt about it. And neither did Dr. Phil, even, who argued that common sense says that if these kids are playing video games where they're on a mass killing spree, it's glamorized on the big screen, it'll become part of the fibre of society. You take that and mix it with a psychopath, a sociopath, or mentally unstable person, add in a dose of rage, and you have a potent mix. This train of thought is due to the media effects model, which tries to play on a connection between people's consumption of the mass media and their subsequent behaviour. It claims that violent video games will commonly have direct and reasonably predictable effects upon the behaviour of the consumers. Now, this is all just a way for people to try and rationalise their moral panics, which are driven by emotion and fear over reasoned thought. This sort of, oh, I haven't seen it or I don't play it, but I don't like it type of reasoning. Now, in the Ferguson reading, Professor Ferguson, a professor of psychology, pointed out that new forms of media all experience cycles of moral panic, during which they are blamed for any youth murder or scraped knee. This is, of course, what happened in the mid-last century with comic books depicting fighting or violence, and a psychiatrist even testified before the US Congress that Batman and Robin were secretly gay, and this would lead the youths to delinquency and pink shirts. Now, of course, fast forwarding a number of decades, and we do have things on television such as Glee and Andrew O'Keefe, but surely can't be a connection. Now, these days, these moral panics help enforce the popular video game myths that they are all addictive, antisocial, unhealthy, that they are only played by teenagers, boys, and nerds, and that they cause violence or that they are all violent. This is why the basis of the Columbine lawsuit stated that the perpetrators of that crime were addicted to this shooter game and that the violence in that game influenced their actions. And rather than blaming the lax gun laws that they have in America, the divide between rich and poor and the social issues that creates, and the culture of bullying that they have in their high schools, it's easy to point the finger at video games because it's a new form of media and we don't understand it yet, just like half a century earlier with comic books. However, this media effects model, which influences these moral panics, is inherently flawed because, as our wonderful lecturer Stephen Harrington pointed out, it chooses its targets selectively, They use questionable approaches to their research where they have a warped direction of reasoning. They decide on their conclusion before analysing the data, sort of putting the cart before the horse, or so to speak, and that they decontextualise. Harrington also made a good point in his reading that said it's like saying that someone is in danger of becoming a serial killer after watching a few episodes of Dexter. And the proper scientific and socially contextualized studies actually further back this up. In Professor Ferguson's reading, he found that the best studies now show no support for the belief that video game violence contributes to youth violence. In his own study, he found that mental health problems are the main protagonist of antisocial behavior, not video game violence or even television. He also found little evidence that video game violence causes a reduction in empathy or antisocial behavior, and that conversely, youths exposed to video game violence actually engage in more pro-social behavior due to interactive gameplay and so on. So for those falling into the trap of giving weight to these moral panics that video games are bad for society and that they'll be the death of us all, they do well to actually consider the facts. These are that most popular video games these days don't always contain violence, such as Madden NFL, Just Dance 1, or even Just Dance 2, and that in fact the most popular games these days are actually puzzles. This is because when people are on a bus or a train, they're sitting there and they're bored, they want to be mentally stimulated, so they play a game on their phone. However, if you're at home, a simple puzzle won't provide the best mental stimulation, so many people choose to play something like Modern Warfare 3 because it provides that same stimulation, but on a higher level. And the research suggests that this stimulation on the brain provided by games actually has a positive effect on mental capacity, which dispels the sort of unhealthy myth. Gamers, when playing these games, aren't looking to act out some sort of twisted, sadistic fantasy that'll act as a gateway to some sort of Unabomber-style social rampage. It's contextualized violence, which is, no matter how much some people don't want to admit it, is simply a form of entertainment. Gamers want to be entertained. They want to be mentally stimulated. They want to engage in positive social behavior and interactive gameplay with other friends. This is backed up by the fact that 70% of gamers prefer playing as part of a group with other friends. The fact is that violence among young people has dropped significantly in the last 40 years, which incidentally is the same 40 years since video games have been introduced. The youth generation of today are the most PC, the least violent, the least likely to start 2 world wars and invade Poland, the most civically involved, the least likely to use drugs, unless of course it's caffeine and you're trying to cram for an assignment. It's simply a case of the uninformed lending credence to these false moral panic myths that are based on a flawed media effects theory. Research shows people who don't play these games are the ones that are most likely to believe these myths, and that human nature of course stipulates that people fear that which they don't understand and overstate the negative impacts. To conclude, Professor Ferguson for me said it best when he wrote simply that the video game violence issue is a crusade in desperate search of a crisis.